bring in retired four-star General Stanley McChrystal, who's out with a brand new book on character, choices that define a life. General, I'll get to the book in 1 second, but I have to ask you a question because I don't get to talk to you that often. Before you resigned in 2010, your military career revolved around that general region of the world, particularly Afghanistan. We witnessed this historic moment where President Trump shook hands with the new president of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa, and promised to waive U.S. sanctions against Syria. It wasn't so long ago that the U.S. had labeled that very man an al-Qaeda terrorist. What do you think of that moment?
I actually think it's good. I spent 5 years, just short of 5 years, in Iraq, largely fighting against al-Qaeda in Iraq and then later ISIS. But the reality is wars have to end. And you have to make peace with the people who you were fighting with. So this may not work out, but I think it's the right thing to do. As I point out to people, Menachem Begin was a terrorist. Nelson Mandela was labeled a terrorist. There are other people who we label in the moment, but I think we've got to be broad enough to say, let's move forward and see what we can do.
Yeah, I'm sure you would agree that Mandela and Begin were fighting for things that were a little bit more defensible than al-Qaeda, but I take your point.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your book on character. This comes after 15 years after President Obama accepted your resignation after that Rolling Stone article, which, by the way, I kind of thought, I was a White House reporter at the time. Nobody cared what my opinion was. I was just reporting the news, but I kind of thought it was a bum deal. You're not actually quoted saying anything negative in the piece. Some aides to you are, but in any case. You talk about that moment leading to an identity crisis in your book, but you say you came out stronger, which I don't doubt. Many of our viewers will probably find that journey inspirational, because I'm sure it was very difficult. And again, if you think you got a bum deal, I agree. But tell us about your journey.
Yeah, when it happened, regardless of the reason, I accepted responsibility for it because that's what I think you should do.
That's what generals do.
Yeah.
Politicians tend not to, but yes.
I came out of the White House where President Obama had been very gracious in a difficult moment. And I wasn't in command again. I wasn't a general. I wasn't even a soldier. And I go back across the city to where my wife had been living in quarters. And we'd been married 33 years. And I'd flown all night from Afghanistan. And I walk in the first floor and I look at her and I said, Annie, it's over. President accepted my resignation. And she looked at me and she goes, good. We've always been happy and we'll always be happy. And it was just a shocking moment, but it was so positive because, as I joke with people, Annie lives her life like she drives with no use for the rearview mirror. And what it did, though, is it made me realize we had to move forward. Now, I'm not going to tell you it was easy because I felt
Sure, it was awful.
Disoriented, shocked, embarrassed, every word you can do. Frankly, I considered suicide. But once you realize that there's going to be a tomorrow and you can't control things in the past, but you can control things in the future, what I tried to do was conduct my life after that so that everyone who had believed in me before that incident, that story, would be reinforced that they had believed in the right person. And people who had never met me wouldn't suddenly say, well, this is the person from the Rolling Stone article, therefore this is the way he is. I tried to get them to see me and then go, wow, that doesn't seem to match what I read about in the article. And it got easier day after day, month after month, year after year. I'll be honest, it still hurts at times. But you realize that there's so much ahead of you that we have control over, each of us, individually.
So you bring up suicidal ideation. And I'm so glad that you didn't. And I'm sure your family is so glad, and your 3 granddaughters that live next to you that you see. And
right.
What kept you from doing that?
I think it was probably Annie. I did have I think I had pretty core beliefs in what was important in life and what wasn't important. But I was just so humiliated in the moment. And I thought that every time I walked through an airport, people who saw me, and I'd see them sort of point at me and talk, and I assumed they were saying something negative. I think a lot of that was in my mind.
Probably.
People, when they talked to me, didn't say that, but the reality is it was. So it was only when I realized there were so many more important things, and actually not living would have been a coward's way out.
The book is on character choices that define a life. Retired 4-star General Stanley McChrystal is here. Thank you so much for being here. Please come here more often. We love having you, and you're such a great expert. And what you just shared with everybody was remarkable, and I'm really kind of taken aback and moved by it. Thank you so much, General.
You're kind, Jake. Thanks.
Appreciate it.